Welcome to the 53rd session of Bhutan Dialogues. My name is 𝗕𝗂𝗓𝗿. I work as the president of 𝗦𝗰𝗶𝗲𝗀 College, our venue for today's event. Our theme for today is Science, Inner Transformation and Buddhism in the Modern World. Buddhism, like all religions, is also continuously nurtured by the phenomena of modification and expansion by its encounter with new cultures. Since its birth in India in the late 6th century, Buddhism has transformed through syncretism, yet simultaneously it continues to hold on to its core scriptural and ritual basis. Over the centuries, Buddhism has adapted to different cultures, has manifested different forms of expression, and has been fluid with the changing times. Today, as we witness how it has become a tool not just for scholars but also for scientists to comprehend the science of the mind, the intangible consciousness. As we try to navigate this difficult VUCA world exacerbated by the global pandemic, rift between nations, revolutions, job losses, and various societal issues that are ever so prevalent in the modern world, how can we create room for the Buddhist modernism and inward-directed science to elevate modern predicaments? To delve a bit deeper on how Buddhism can play the role of the science and happiness to bring a new perspective to the modern world, allow me the pleasure of introducing an international best-selling author who is also the founder of Karuna-Shechen, a humanitarian, translator, photographer, and a Buddhist monk with a doctorate in molecular genetics, Matthieu Ricard. As you can see, as we can all see the background, Matthieu Ricard is a scientific researcher and a practitioner of Buddhism. He is, I may like to add, he is also a subject of research in the study of the mind, the recent study that is changing our perspective on the development of the brain, the changes that happen here as a result of training of the mind. So we cannot have a more holistic person to talk on the subject of science and inner transformation and Buddhism. On this beautiful autumn evening, we are indeed blessed with his presence. Welcome to 𝗪𝗓𝗔 Live. Our host, I think, needs no introduction. However, he is Dr. Karma Phuntsho. He is the founder of the Lopen Foundation and currently sits on Lopen's board of trustees. He is a spiritual thought leader, Buddhist teacher, and the writer in digital residence for the Buddha Nature Project at the 𝗬𝗪 Foundation. There will be a Q&A session afterwards, and I would like to request that questions to the panel be kept short and to the point in the interest of allowing time for more questions and for in-depth responses, rendering the Q&A session a meaningful exchange. Our online viewers may drop their questions in the chat box. The Bhutan Dialogues team will compile the questions and read them out during the Q&A session. Thank you and 𝗪𝗪 𝗪𝗪. So over to Dr. Karma Phuntsho.
Welcome to the 53rd session of Bhutan Dialogues. And in particular, Matthieu, welcome to the Bhutan Dialogue session. We have actually been trying very hard to get you even earlier. We have had this for almost 5 years now, hoping to create a kind of a space for what in Tibetan Buddhism you would call 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗪, or in simply put, critical thinking, and to practice mindful listening, right speech, and civil conversations, and all with the aim of also sort of pushing the boundaries of our thought and trying to refine human progress, or what human progress means. And you, having authored many books, given so many talks, and having undertaken projects, direct application of wisdom and compassion in action, we couldn't get a better person to talk about refining human progress. So thank you very much for joining us. I normally start by asking my guest how you came to be who you are. You started as a scientist and then have turned into a Tibetan Buddhist monk. Can you recall that point when you made that decision? Yeah. Do you rejoice in it now, or do you regret it?
Well, the question, who you are, is of course, it's a big question. Is there anyone who can be something? You know, is there a self who can become something? That's another question. So, but anyway, in terms of life trajectory, I was very fortunate to grow, to be exposed in my youth, in my teens, to people who were quite remarkable in their own fields. My father was a philosopher, a writer, a journalist, so there was a lot of intellectuals coming to our home. My mother, who is now almost 100, is a painter, so all the painters of the time she was friends with. I had an uncle who was an explorer. I was also interested in classical music and met many great musicians, and as a scientist also, I was accepted in the lab of François Jacob and Jacques Monod to French Nobel Prize. So it's not just to throw names, but to simply to say that I could meet many people who were considered to be, you know, quite remarkable in their own domain. But there was one thing, and I think more retrospectively, it didn't strike me at the time, but as a young person, you look for a role model in life. And what was disconcerting is that, you know, you could take 50 gardeners or wood, you know, carpenters and mathematicians and musicians and philosophers, and you would find an equal distribution of people who were very nice people and people who were quite difficult, people who were happy or miserable, and who were selfish or altruistic. There was no obvious correlation between a particular genius and being a good human being. You know, I was also a fan of playing chess, and in those days, one of the most great luminaries of chess, Bobby Fischer, a kind of genius. At the same time, he was a completely perturbed and, you know, very difficult human being. So this was disconcerting, because you would like to have their skills, but not to become what they are. So, you know, then it's where to look in life to become a good human being. So that was a sort of questioning I had, and I had no answer until I saw some documentaries made by a friend of my parents, Arnaud Desjardins, who for 6 months went all over India, and he came to Bhutan as well, to document all the great Buddhist masters, some of them here who were staying here, but also like Lopen Karma Phuntsho, yes. But many of them who had fled the communist invasion of Tibet and sought refuge all over the Himalayas. So when I saw those documentaries, there was 2 and then he made 2 more, suddenly I thought, well, here, today, there are 20 Socrates, 20 Saint Francis of Assisi, 20, I don't know, you could give example of people, remarkable people from the past, 20 Longchenpa, 20, so living today. So then I thought, well, I should go and meet them. So when I met my first teacher in Darjeeling, Kangyu Rinpoche, and then later Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, I didn't know much about Buddhism, being a scientist, and I had read a few things on different religions, but I was not knowledgeable. But what struck me from the start was their quality as human beings. That was quite obvious. And I thought if I could become just 1/100 of this, that would be worth spending a good deal of my life. So suddenly I had a sense of direction. Before I didn't know what I wanted my life. I know what I didn't want my life to be, that means boring, meaningless, and so forth. But I didn't know what I wanted to be. And now, the sense of direction, I think, is so important for young people. Like if you go in the mountains, say you walk from here to across Pachuding to Paro, if you know you are on the right way, it goes up and down, it might rain, it might have a beautiful landscape and sometimes difficult. But every step is a joy in form of effort because you have a goal, either to meet someone remarkable or an hermit or to go to see some beautiful lakes or whatever. I just walked to Laya at 77, I tell you, I think it's no more my age to do that. But there's a joy in sense of getting there. So, but if you lose your direction, you just sit on a big stone, there's mist, and why should you go further? Because you don't know if those steps will lead you further astray or closer, you don't know, so you feel all the burden of exhaustion and despair. So I think sense of direction is important, and I found it with my teachers.
Yes. So, yeah, as you said, and I have read a bit about you, I've actually known you for many years now. You have been interested in astronomy, you have been interested in ornithology. You've already published a book on ornithology before 20.
On animal migration.
Animal
yes.
migration, yeah. So you've been working in Pasteur Institute, a very renowned place for scientists, and have a doctorate in microbiology. But then you talk about meaning in life and the sense of direction. Do you think your understanding of meaning at that time, when you met Kangyu Rinpoche and Khyentse Rinpoche, and the meaning you see now has remained the same? What is that meaning, if you can explain to particularly the young audience here?
So I think, I was lucky because when I entered Pasteur Institute, then same time I met my teacher. And, at the end of my first stay in Darjeeling in 1967, I told my teacher, I'm engaged into something, a process. A PhD didn't mean anything for him, but and so in case I was contemplating spending more time here, should I do it soon? Or he said, well, if you started something, just first finish that, and then you can see. And I think that was such a wonderful advice. Because over the 6 years and 7 back and forth, I used to come in the summer holiday for 1 month to Darjeeling. Then this matured. And then at the time I finished my PhD and my boss wanted me to go a postdoc in the US. He was sort of feeling that there was something that was going to happen, but I said, I'm going to do my postdoc in the Himalaya. But then it's like when a fruit is ripe, you just put your hand, an apple, and it falls in your hand. If it's not ripe, you pull and you break the branch, and it doesn't work. So people say, how can you live Parisian life? It must have been a shock, it must have been a rupture. Actually, not at all. It was exactly the right time. And what would have been difficult for me to stay longer. It's like you reach a mountain pass. The last few meters, you suddenly discover another beautiful valley. And when you leave the valley before, you are not abandoning it, you are not rejecting it. It's simply a new phase in your life. So I never felt I was slamming doors on Parisian life. No, except Camembert, I didn't miss very much of Parisian life. But it was the right time, and it would have been it would have been difficult for me to stay longer, and it was perfect. So that was, I was very lucky in the sense to have this time to mature that decision. And I remember that at the end, when I was in Darjeeling, I was completely forgetting about Pasteur Institute. And then when I was in Pasteur Institute, my mind will always fly to my teacher. So then it came at the right time. And after that, not one time, 1 second, one thought I ever regretted that. I think to retire at 26 was the perfect decision. And then the rest of my life, I feel so fortunate then to have continued to live with those great teachers. I spent 13 years with 𝗔 Khyentse Rinpoche, including 10 years in Bhutan most of the year. I feel, I mean, I didn't accumulate any special qualities, but I feel incredibly fortunate, so I can die at peace.
So it was worth giving up the camembert. Huh? Did you miss red
so
wine?
So my friends used to, when they come to Darjeeling, they used to bring me camembert. And I promise I never wasted the camembert, no matter what the condition it was.
Nice. Wonderful.
For those who don't know, camembert is a special French cheese. A bit smelly for Bhutanese and Tibetans, but French love that.
It's a bit like our mature cheese here. Like ours. Matthieu, as you shut your door to Parisian life and moved to live in this hermetic place in Darjeeling, it's a big jump. And as we go to discuss our topic, for instance, when you look at science, science, as a lot of us here understand, is very much based on matter, on some concrete, tangible things that you dissect or study, analyze, and sort of reach a conclusion based on evidence. Whereas here, it's so much based on the mind, as you know. So it's a rather big jump. And how do you see this matter-focused science and the mind-centered Buddhist inner transformation working together?
Well, I'm not sure it's just a big jump. First of all, I must say that those 6 years plus at Pasteur Institute with François Jacob, who was a really great scientific mind, gave me the taste for rigor. You know, not any sort of, jumping into, things that doesn't make sense. So I have a great depth of gratitude for that scientific training, the scientific methodology. My father also was a very rigorous intellectual, always checking his sources and so forth. Well, when you say that, yes, in a way, we say that science is something that can be measured and so forth. But, since 19th century, William James, psychology is a science. And anyway, it has to be put to the test, all the criteria of what makes a scientific discovery, that it has to be putting hypotheses that can be refuted and so forth, like Karl Popper's point of refutability. You cannot just say something that works in any case, no matter what. It has to be standing to the reality. And I remember when we did one of those Mind and Life conference, which brings together the Dalai Lama and scientists and Buddhist scholars at MIT on investigating the mind. I think it was 2013 or something. Each of the Buddhist scholars were paired with a scientist. And I was paired with Stephen Kosslyn, who had the chair of psychology at Harvard. And we had this discussion. So he began his speech by saying he must pay tribute to the mass of experimental data that Buddhist science of mind was bringing to the field of psychology for centuries. So in a way, what makes a science? Science is a rigorous approach to reality. Buddhism, one of the principles in Buddhism is to bridge the gap between appearances and reality. We have a tendency to believe things are permanent. This watch is the same as yesterday. No, definitely not. It changes every fraction of a second. Something is changing. The minute impermanence is always there. Nothing can remain identical to itself 2 consecutive instants. But we think it's more or less permanent. We think that it's a separate entity. We don't realize that it's all happens only through interdependence. So all this kind of investigation to bridge the gap between appearance and reality, in a way, is quite close to idea of scientific discovery, which is to describe the law of nature, and also to make predictions about them, to explain them. Now, of course, most of the science, natural science, physics, and so forth, except mathematics and others, deal with things that can be measured.
Yeah. So that,
science of mind is a bit
yes,
different, but it also has prediction and result. You know, if you think that hatred is going to bring happiness, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think we agree that in terms of methodology and the analytical, rational rigor, Buddhism and modern science shares that. But then here, especially in the Bhutanese schools, when we talk about science, it's often material science, biology, physics, chemistry. And psychology is also a new science in the West, isn't it? William James and all the sort of psychologists were more or less people of 20th century or late 19th century and onwards. So here the bias is that scientists normally talk about matter. And I've actually come across many scientists. I don't know if you have microbiologists today, if the mainstream microbiologists and geneticists believe that there is something called the mind, apart from the brain waves.
Yes.
So for a lot of us here who have done science in schools, it's something associated with matter. Psychology is still not.
Sure.
And so to go to a mind-centered Buddhist tradition, how can we bring the two together?
Well, you know, it is true that psychology and cognitive science were considered so-called soft science. It's a little bit derogatory. And I remember many of my neuroscientist friends, like Richard Davidson and Tanya Singer, who 20, 30 years ago started to study science of emotion with neuroscience. And people say, no, emotion, you know, that's just something very, sort of vague thing. You know, this is not serious, like finding out how the cognitive process of attention and memory works, and you call the neural networks. So they were look a little bit like, you know, sort of lightweight science. But now, of course, it's quite different. Now it's taken a prime time, you know, notion of emotional intelligence being a better predictor than IQ for flourishing and success in life. And also, people recognize the fact that, you know, our mind can be our best friend, our worst enemy, and it happens that we deal with our mind from morning till evening. So the way our mind works, in fact, determines the quality of our world. It is the mind that transforms into happiness or misery the outer conditions. And the mind, of course, outer conditions are important, and we should improve them as much as we can, remedying to poverty in the midst of plenty and so forth, social justice and so forth. Nevertheless, we know that the mind can override somehow the outer conditions. You can feel miserable in the little paradise. You know, you hear of someone who is very famous, beautiful, rich, and so forth, and then we hear that he's completely depressed. You say, what's wrong with this guy? You know, if I had all that, I would be happy, of course, but that's not the case. And conversely, you can keep your joy of being alive and the sense of purpose and kindness and altruism, even in the face of great adversity. So outer conditions, of course, matter, but somehow we have a tendency to neglect, to cultivate the inner condition for flourishing, happiness, and so forth. And that's a big mistake, because we feel quite you know, powerless when the outer condition change. And in any case, our control on the outer condition is very limited, it's ephemeral, and it's so often illusory. You know, we are the boss, and then next day we are fired, or the thing go bankrupt. So we can't control all that. While with the mind, at least, we can work on it and, you know, cultivate and bring to the ultimate point some basic human qualities like attention, you know, altruism, inner strength, resilience, and so forth. Those can be cultivated as skills. And the research of neuroscience, I think last time I was here, I presented some data of the research. It shows that clearly that those skills can be cultivated. You know, it's not like given. We're not born learning how to read and write. So we know that every single human skill takes time to master. But which mystery, you know, altruism, attention, will be at the top right from the start, or completely unchanging, like graving stone. No, they are just like any other skill. Everyone might not reach to the same point, but there's a huge latitude of change if we train into any of those skills. And that together makes a sense of flourishing.
Yeah, and so you have done a lot of work on this, and reading you, it almost seems to somebody like me that even science is now catching up with the science of the mind, and especially your work on altruism shows how sort of recent scientific work actually argues that altruism is sort of inborn in us. Your work on happiness, the bestseller, is also arguing in that direction. Now, when we talk about that, then one of the things, especially talking about Buddhism in the modern world, in much of the world, individualism is very strong. So especially in the Western world, you have this sense of the I and the self and private space, individual rights. How does Buddhist concept of interdependence and altruism and benevolence sort of work with the cultural, sort of rampant culture of individualism?
Yes, so there are two aspects to individualism. One is very legitimate. I mean, when people were reduced as slaves and so forth, when people were reduced as instruments to the benefit of others, then of course you will have a sense of urge to emancipate yourself from this unjust sort of exploitation. And that has been, still it exists now. There are still a lot of millions of slaves in different ways. Even slavery has been so-called abolished in the world. So that aspect of disentangling yourself from authoritarian or whatever, if it is due to religion or to an authoritarian regime, to gain the sense of being able to lead your life according to your aspiration is very legitimate. But the problem is when you go too far, say, after all, I don't care too much about what others are doing. I'm not against them to be happy, but it's not my job. It's much easier if I care for my happiness, and that's all I care for. Well, that bet, which led to a hyper-individualistic society, and sometimes even to the narcissistic epidemic. I mean, there's a book called like that by 𝗠𝗏𝗏 that shows how narcissism, especially in North America, but it's coming to Europe also, has been increasing dramatically over the last 30 years. So that aspect, of course, is bound to fail in terms of flourishing because it is at odds with reality. Now, if we assume that we are all individuals, separate entities, and then we relate to each other a little bit like snooker balls that sometimes hit to each other, but then basically they stand on their own. And then that will be sort of okay to say, okay, I'm building my happiness in my little cocoon, and that's easier than taking care of happiness of others. There's more certainty. I don't need to trust others, this and that. It was easier. So it doesn't work for two reasons. One is me all day long, makes you feel miserable all day long. And then you make others' life miserable as well because you don't care for them and they know that. Secondly, it doesn't work because we are not snooker balls. We are intimately interdependent. Our happiness and our suffering goes together and through others. So there's no such thing as a isolated happiness. So therefore, if you bet on that so-called separate entities, it is dysfunctional. So at the end of the day, you're going to suffer out of that. While interdependence is closely connected to altruism and compassion. Because first it's recognizing our common humanities, and we could even say common sentience with others, 8 million species, many of them have a quite developed consciousness. And so among those, there's not a single sentient being who wakes up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day and if possible my whole life. No matter what kind of definition we have of happiness, at least for sure we don't want to suffer. So that's a common denominator. So if I'm concerned by my aspiration not to suffer, I recognize that deep within. I would rather not suffer if it's possible. then I'm concerned by that. Then I will try to act and speak and think in ways that do not perpetuate my suffering. Or very often we are addicted to the cause of suffering, repeatedly. So now, if I transport myself in others' mind, it's not rocket science to find out that, yes, also they can be confused, like I am confused, but no one wants to suffer. So that is common. We are all interdependent in that. Therefore, I should also be concerned about their happiness and suffering. And now I should also act and speak and think in ways that will not harm them. So interdependence basically is the foundation of altruism and compassion, recognition of interdependence.
Well, you say it's not rocket science to understand happiness or what is suffering oneself, but then we have this habitual tendency. We are driven by our habitual tendency to sort of get into the causes of suffering, although we don't like suffering. And in that respect, to a large extent, when people think about happiness, you're thinking about happiness derived from some sensual pleasure. How do you move from that level to a more meaningful, fulfilling happiness? And you work on this in your book.
So there's nothing wrong with, with pleasure per se, but we should not confuse it with flourishing and well-being. Just very simple. You look at the characteristics. A pleasant sensation is very ephemeral. It doesn't last. And also, it's not by repeating it, it will fade away. Now, if you eat a delicious chocolate cake, maybe good, 2 pieces, okay, 5, you get sick. Now, if you listen to the most beautiful music, some people will listen 3 times at a row at something they like, but 24 hours a day, they use it in Guantanamo as torture. Or you take a hot shower after being in the snow in Laya, it's like bliss, but 24 hours in a hot shower will not do. So it's like a candle that consumes itself. And also you can do it, you can feel those pleasant sensations in a very selfish way, even at the cost of others' suffering. So basically the pursuit of endless repeated pleasant sensation is a recipe for exhaustion, not for happiness. Now happiness, the more, in the sense of a way of being, a way of being that is not something mysterious, it is a cluster of most fundamental human qualities, say like altruism, sense of fortitude or resilience, inner freedom. And by that I mean don't do whatever comes in your mind. That's not freedom, that's being the slave of your thoughts. Inner freedom means not being the slave of your automatic thinking, the slave of your aversion and attractions. So freedom from this mental conditioning, the blah blah of the neurons. So that's, and then compassion, all these qualities together, they make what we call sukha in Sanskrit and dewa in Tibetan. So that means a way of being. And then the more you experience it, the more you become expert or skilled or familiar with that. So it grows with experience at the opposite of pleasure. So there's nothing wrong with pleasure, but it becomes wrong, it becomes detrimental to your happiness when you crave, when you get strongly attached. Say, this crystal glass, like ding. So it's a pleasant sensation that is lived within freedom. But if you start craving and grasping, is that you put your finger on the rim of the crystal glass and then the sound stops. It can become suffering. So the point is to distinguish them. It's not that we should discard pleasant sensation, that would be ridiculous, but we should not get strong grasping to it and not believe that the repetition of those is going to bring a genuine sense of fulfillment, because that's not the case.
Which is a very difficult task, to not be attached to pleasure. But then another thing regarding individualism, and something that has beset the Buddhists in the modern context, is you have on the one hand this practice of pure perception. You see everything as good. And on the other hand, especially in recent times, we had, with the rise of Me Too movement, people being extremely sort of critical where do we find the balance to have a wholesome Buddhist practice of pure perception and love and respect,
Yes.
and at the same time take necessary measure to keep the black sheep out?
So to put it in context, we speak in the form of Buddhism that is prevalent in Bhutan, in Tibet and Mongolia, which we call the Vajrayana Buddhism or so forth. They are uniting the three levels or three vehicles or three yanas. So the fundamental vehicle is meant to disentangle oneself from the endless suffering of samsara, which is connected with ignorance, with distortion of reality and so forth. So then what we need is a sense of lassitude, of tiredness toward the samsaric life. We speak of non-attachment. So now it should be understood correctly. Non-attachment is not saying I'm not going to eating strawberry ice cream anymore. If something is really good in life, that would be stupid to give it up. It's not to be attached to the cause of suffering. When a bird goes out of its cage, you don't say he's renouncing its cage. He's just freeing himself from the cage. So that's the fundamentals of the fundamental vehicle.
Yeah.
Now the great vehicle, so-called Mahayana, is the idea that if I free myself from the jail where all my friends are still in, there's no fun. So the idea that liberation just for oneself is very limited, and it also will not bring great fulfillment. So the idea to achieve the state of Buddhahood, not just to be happy in a kind of one-sided nirvana, but to gain the capacity to free all beings from suffering. Because right now, we are like a beggar who wants to give a banquet to 100 beggars. We don't have what it takes to give a banquet. So if we cultivate those qualities that bring to Buddhahood, then we have this capacity. Now, pure vision is special to the Vajrayana. It's based on the fact that we function in a very dualistic manner. This is good, this is bad, this is beautiful, this is ugly, this is desirable, undesirable. But those are mostly projection of the mind. Take example of a roses. For a poet, he will go on and on describing the beauty, the fragrance of the roses. For a snail, it's just a good meal, a salad. And for a tiger, it means nothing. And if you go at the subatomic level, a rose is just a whirlpool of particles or quantum vacuum. So we don't realize that we attribute intrinsic properties to things. This is an enemy, fundamentally, even though it was your best friend 2 weeks ago. So we project, we distort reality, and that's dysfunctional. So what means pure vision is to recognize that phenomena manifest infinitely, but they are all devoid of, say, intrinsic existence. They are interdependent, they don't exist on their own, they don't have intrinsic properties. And by the way, it's always not very good to make cheap comparison with modern science, but it's quite true that if you look at quantum physics, the idea of non-locality, that in fact reality is non-local. Einstein was thinking that particles have intrinsic properties that they carry with themselves. Now, quantum physics and the last Nobel Prize to Alain Aspect, he showed that even two particles are miles and miles away, they are still globally connected somehow without sharing information. So I'm not going to go in details, but reality is global, it's not localized. So pure vision is to recognize that. It's also to recognize that each and every sentient being has so-called the Buddha nature. So what does that mean? That if we look at consciousness, our ordinary consciousness is a mixture of light and shadows, of ignorance, of animosity, of attraction. But at the very foundation of that, the basic faculty of knowing, you could know anything, but that faculty of knowing, that most fundamental aspect of consciousness, is not changed by the content. So to give an example, if you have a torchlight, if you light up a heap of garbage, light doesn't become dirty. If you light a mound of gold, light doesn't become expensive. Light just reveals that. So that basic nature of consciousness is like the space that allows all the mountains and the birds and the clouds. but it's not changed by the content. That means it is, we could say it's neither good or bad, but it's certainly not corrupted. So to recognize that in every sentient being is also called pure vision. So that's very important, because otherwise we easily fall in the wicked world syndrome. Now, there are about 3% psychopaths in any society. But there's a tendency now in the media to focus on that only. So the worst aspect of human nature, and to deduce from that everything is rotten. I've been confronted with that recently in France. You know, it's like saying all the apple orchards of Bhutan are rotten. Why? Because in every orchard, there are few rotten apples. And then you say, okay, education is bad because there's abuse. No, art is bad because there's abuse. Family is bad because there's abuse. Religion are bad, look at what they do. So there's always a number of people who do terrible things. But if you keep on digging on the septic tank of humanity and think there's only that and push everybody in it, then you fall into very distorted vision of human nature.
Yeah, so we all suffer from some degree of negativity bias. Now we see the very small percent of the negative and miss on all the...
And they think they're very smart. I mean, there's to give you an idea how people think that those who have a negative view are probably closer to reality. There was a study where you gave people two, how do you call, critics of a book. A book didn't exist, but one was saying a lot of critical points about the book. There was this weakness and this and that. And the other one was all praise about the book. And then they asked people, who you think is the more realistic? And 70% of people say, well, the guy who found all the flaws probably more correct. Because this is a tendency, we think that if we criticize something, you are more right. But often it comes to a distortion of reality. Yes. And that's why also we think that everything goes bad, because once in France I was asked to, I came to some TV something, and then they say, we'll ask you to comment on the 5 headlines of the news. So they show me, I look at that and I say, don't you have a good news? No, there's plenty of good things in the world. This was catastrophe, massacre, this and that. So you easily have a truncated vision of reality if you only focus on the bad news. So there is a reason for that. It's evolution has equipped us to react if something is dangerous or threatening. Say, we are all quiet here and we don't pay too much attention. Suppose there's a loud bang somewhere, or we hear two people fighting. Immediately our attention will be drawn there because there's a potential danger. So because of that, we are more sort of attracted to bad news, to terrible things, because it's potentially dangerous when everything goes well. If 100 people help, some elderly, it doesn't make the evening news. If one old lady is killed, then it will be the evening news. So that creates a deformation of reality towards thinking that human nature is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, but you pointed out earlier how human nature, in our true nature, we are like Buddhas. So, but I want to come to that. You were mentioning earlier about the equality, the equalness, the equanimity that we should have towards all sentient beings. But what I wanted to ask you, talking about science and Buddhism in the modern world, we have discussed a bit about materialism. We discussed a bit about individualism. I want to bring up the third sort of element that modern world has brought, particularly to places like Bhutan, and that is anthropocentricity. Anthropocentricity. We are in an Anthropocene world. The human beings are on the top of the sort of food chain, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Whereas here in our traditional worldview, for instance, we are right now in RTC, and RTC has its territorial deity, Gyushung Thankar, who is more important, more powerful than the human beings who sort of pass by. So now when we sort of deal with modern science, there is this very anthropocentric worldview where human beings are the most important, most powerful, and so forth. How do we work with that? Bring the Buddhist view of all sentient beings being equal, and then the scientific view
Well, they are equal. They are different, but they are equal in having the Buddha nature. But anthropocity is really a deformation basically based on ignorance. And because if we think carefully, while human beings are clearly, in terms of pure intelligence, forecasting the future, transmitting, increasing our knowledge in a cumulative way from generation to generation, we are quite unique. Although there are animal cultures, there is transmission from generation to generation, but much more limited. But if you think of it, our intelligence is fine, but we all have the kind of skills that we need to survive. I was waiting for the cranes to come from Tibet. I saw some in 𝗂𝗟𝗧, the first one arrived. Migrating birds, I don't know exactly about the cranes, but some other ones, they can navigate on the stars, or they navigate on the polarization of light. There is one bird that goes from North Canada to New Zealand non-stop, 15,000 kilometers. We will get completely lost. I mean, I came here 9 years ago, but I didn't really recognize the place, and I could not have find it. Bats can navigate in the dark, so they each one has the skills that they need to survive, and for them that's the best skills of all. So for a crane, the crane is the most smartest animal on earth. So we should realize that evolution has equipped us with different skills, and humans are very special. But the idea that we are everything and other species are nothing, or they are just instruments for our pleasure or consumption or others, is a really completely distorted way of perceiving the universe. There are 8 million other species. They are co-citizens in this world. They are subject of life. They have the right to follow their life, to avoid extreme sufferings. And we have also the obligation to let them flourish in their own right.
Thank you for that. I suppose even modern science is making progress with regard to animal rights and arguing for
animal intelligence. Yes. Only very few people can contest that, because it has been shown. You can train pigeons to distinguish between a Rembrandt and a Picasso, provided you give them some grains. I mean, they recognize right away. Some bonobo studies in Japan, in terms of mental calculation and following objects, they are better than an average student. So there are a lot of skills that we don't imagine,
Yes, indeed. Let's open to the audience for questions and see if you have any questions from the audience here or audience online.
One session by Dr. 𝗤𝗏 he was saying that the scientific thinking restricts our actual thinking on reality. And I also heard some other Western scholars saying that the scientific way of analysis and thinking restricts our power, imagination, and thinking. So, Lam's view on this statement. Thank you.
So it depends again what you call science. If science is the pursuit of the nature of reality, the old Buddhist philosophy, Madhyamika and all that, all the different levels of we speak of 4 different main schools of Buddhist philosophy, and it's all about investigating reality in a rigorous way. So if you call science only, again, measuring material things and saying everything else is no interest, then it's a very non-scientific approach, in fact. So very narrow-minded. So it all depends what you call science, yes. So in my mind, science is not at all incompatible with Buddhist thinking. But there is an aspect, we have this analytical meditation in Buddhism. Say when you deconstruct the notion of self, for instance, or where you analyze interdependence or impermanence. So you analyze. But after some point, you go to a contemplative meditation. That means, say, if I realize there's no individual self, I looked everywhere, like someone, you think there's a thief in the house, and you look everywhere, under the beds, under the cupboard. Okay, no thief. Now you are at peace. but you need to integrate that in your deeper sort of mind stream. So that period of assimilation. I just tell you everything is impermanent. You say, okay, yes, but it hasn't got to the deepest of our being. That means we still grasp to things as permanent. So it's an intellectual idea. It's not a living experience. So that aspect maybe not so present in scientific inquiry. I did a dialogue with an astrophysicist called the Quantum and the Lotus in English. And we were agreeing that, when, say, quantum physicists say, okay, reality is non-local. It's a discovery. But will it change their lives? It is not sure. One of those scientists who found non-locality, 𝗦𝗁𝗂𝗍𝗂𝗍𝗂, I know him quite well, he said sometimes the scientists don't use the amazing discovery to use it as a tool for transforming themselves. They lack also the idea of being a scientist should also be a philosopher, and a philosopher in the sense of becoming a better human beings with more wisdom and so forth. So that aspect would be missing, but if you use science properly as a rigorous investigation, I don't see any reason why science should be considered as the enemy of Buddhism or anything like that, or even as a limitation.
I don't know whether this question will be relevant here or not, but over the last more than 3 years, including the COVID, and then whatever the country is going through right now, especially the transformation. And then basically transformation is all about gain. And the way I see transformation is we are trying for something better than that. But with all of these things, we are seeing some issues here in the country, whereby many of the people, I don't know whether it's true or not, but it is opinion. Many of people are living abroad for better opportunities, so many of these things are happening. And then on the other side, the way I see is why is this happening? So when we compare to more than a decade ago, people are happy. People are happy. And then now when we compare now, many people are saying there are no opportunities here. So that's why people are moving, because the transformation is happening. So I would like to ask Sir Matthieu here, how can we cope up with the more desire, with the more need and want that we are having now? And then, as I said earlier, actually, compared to a decade ago, Buddhist people are doing way better. But why suddenly people want to leave the system? So, because, as I said earlier, transformation, we are asking for something better. And then when we say, we want to change for better, we want to do it better, it takes an enormous strength. With this, I would like to ask Matthieu sir here, how can we cope up with this? Thank you so much.
Oh, that's very easy.
Difficult to do.
There's a perfect mantra, and it was one of my favorite mantras. You say 9 times, I did nothing, I did nothing, I did nothing. It feels so good. Like a liberation. Once I remember I was sitting in the balcony of my small hermitage in Nepal. Inside is 3 meters by 3. That much you can put inside, yes? So I imagine there's a fairy that comes and say, you can have 3 wishes, but only on the material level. So I thought, well, I cannot get a television set anyway, it's going to distract me. So I try to think, what could I need in my hermitage? And then I start bursting in laughter, because there was nothing I could wish more than what a little bit I had in my hermitage. I was so happy to be there. And then soon after, I was in Thailand with a friend who's helping us to accomplish some of our humanitarian projects. So he had a beautiful estate with a swimming pool. And that day he was away, and I was swimming alone in the swimming pool, and I feel so bored, And I thought of my hermitage. I said, it's so much nicer over there. Then I thought, imagine I spent my whole life getting this multi-million property and end up swimming alone in the swimming pool and feel dead bored. I thought it was so funny, I almost swallowed the water. So there is a saying that if you have one and you want two, you open the door to the demon. And once the Dalai Lama had a visitor who had 4 rings, and he told him, you know, you only have 10 fingers, so even you put 10 rings, that's it. But if you are not enough, then the whole hurt will not be enough, because having enough is a sense of satisfaction, of contentment. And we have a saying in the Tibetan, in the Buddhist scriptures, to have a sense of contentment is holding a treasure in the palm of your hand, because you are satisfied. And to know how to be satisfied is not a resignation. It's not craving for the totally unnecessary. And that's one of the drama of our modern times. We have a craving for the superfluous. We need more a happy simplicity. When you know that an average US citizen emits 200 times more CO2 than a Zambian, a Qatari 2,000 more times than an Afghani. This is crazy. No, there are 2 cars for 3 people in the US. If it was like that in the whole world, the whole fossil fuel will be exhausted in 1 year. It's unachievable, it's undesirable, and it's completely unpractical. So in developed countries, there's a crisis of the superfluous, of things that we don't need to be happy. So I was thinking with a friend that we should make some, in France, those big posters, advertise on this and that. By the way, the marketing ideas developed in the 1930s. And from in own words of those who developed marketing, it was to make people desire and buy what they don't need. Because if you need something, you don't need to have advertisement. When I need something for my camera, I know exactly what I want, I go and buy, and that's it. So advertisement is only you buy what you don't need. So we thought of making a campaign in Paris, putting, using advertising places to say, don't buy what we don't need. Spend time with your kids. Enjoy nature. I'm not sure they would have taken our publicity advertisement.
Nice. So I'll ask a follow-up question to what Tharchin asked, but before that, is there a question online? Yeah, let's take one.
Yes, so we have a few questions from our online viewers. Question number 1, a psychopathic person is neurologically wired to lack empathy and compassion. So does that mean that Buddha nature is not always innate in human beings? And the follow-up question is, how does a psychopath attain enlightenment?
So psychopaths, they are, briefly, there's 2 kinds of empathy. One is affective empathy. You suffer, I resonate, and I suffer because of your suffering. You come to a place where everybody is laughing and joyful. Before even knowing the subject of the conversation, you start smiling. So that's called affective resonance. So psychopaths don't have that. They can cut people in pieces and they think it's great because they don't feel the suffering. But there's another form of empathy, which is cognitive empathy, theory of mind. That means, what is this person thinking? What is in that person's mind? Psychopaths happen to be very smart at that, so that's why they can manipulate people. It's very hard to help psychopaths to cure, because I've been discussing a lot with people who deal with psychopaths. They say, when you try to make an intervention, they use the way you do it to then instrumentalize you further. But unfortunately, there's not so many people. So yes, of course, they have Buddha nature. But Buddha nature is like a piece of gold. It can be fall in the mud, but gold is still gold. I remember having asked to come and talk with some prisoners in a high security prison in France, where people are there for 20 years, usually for terrible things. So I spoke about them, about no matter what, there is this potential within. The point is how to bring it at the surface, how to pick up that piece of gold that is in the mud and clean it. When you clean the gold, you have not improved the gold, you just reveal its true nature. When it's in the mud, gold is not lost its nature, it's simply covered. So one of them said, this is very comforting, because in the prison sometimes they had spiritual advisor say coming, well, you have the original sin, so you're born with that. Second, you kill someone, number 2. Third, you are in jail for the rest of your life. No, not very encouraging. So when you tell them that no matter what, there is a potential that you can bring at the surface. And Nelson Mandela, when he was speaking about his jailers, he said, I found, even spending 20 years or even more, I think, in the jail, that if you go deep within, there's always some goodness somewhere deep within every person. So that confidence makes you that, that with some effort, with some following a process, you can bring the best of yourself at the surface, and the potential is there. And to recognize that potential is the most encouraging thing, even it's masked, enveloped, hidden. We are often in the Buddhist scripture, it said we are like a beggar which has a huge nugget of gold under its little house. He is rich and poor at the same time. He is rich because the gold is there. He is poor because he doesn't know. So the idea is to recognize that potential and gradually to actualize it. So the Buddhist path is not about fabricating sort of Buddhahood or goodness. It's removing the veils and the clouds and the obscuration that mask that innate goodness.
So I suppose in the Buddhist scriptures you find this class of people, the Echantikas, those whose Buddha nature is so deeply, so thickly obscured that it looks like they don't have one, but they actually do have one which can be revealed.
Well, they may not happen in this life. No, well, it's possible that it's buried very deep, and you don't have the tools, the opportunity, the example in life, the inspiration of someone who makes you look for that. And you can go on and on, killing people. There was a psychopath. I studied a little bit psychopaths when I wrote the book on altruism, because you need to see the other side. He was basically in Spain going to public places and seeing all elderly people and telling them, I can help you and come do some works in your home. And then he would befriend them, mostly old ladies, and then he would go to their home and basically kill them. And so, then when he was finally found out, in the court he said, well, people go to movie, I'd like to kill old ladies. So he thought it's just another way of doing it. So they don't have any of those empathic feelings. That's the problem.
So now to wrap up, I have got 2 last questions for you, Yala. One, as a follow-up to what Thachin was asking, you have come to Thimphu in 1980. I discovered that while we were driving here. Most of the people here in the audience were born after that. So can you compare the Bhutan that you saw in 1980 and the Bhutan now? And what should we treasure as a blessing?
Well,
what would be advice
in terms of
that
question? I don't know.
I'm asking about the direction of life you mentioned at the beginning. What should Bhutan's direction be?
Well, I've been puzzled, I must say, especially by Thimphu, the way it changed. Between the Dzong and the Shencheling at the end of the valley, there was not a single house. Wow, now there's quite a lot. I don't know what to say. You can't stop the demography. And, but to tell frankly, compared to many other countries, when you go out, to Bhutan and Phobjika and all that, it's still very well preserved. So I think there's a danger, but so far, definitely it's not a lost cause. Yes. Now, in terms of what would be best for the Bhutanese people, you know better than me, I don't know. But obviously, every country, like if I take France, in the beginning of the 20th century, I think there was 60 or more % of people in agriculture. Now it's only 5%. It's people everybody in technology, communication. They communicate. I don't know about what, but they communicate. So all these virtual things, that's why people can work at home virtually during the COVID. When you are a farmer, you don't work virtually from your room, yes? Or you are a carpenter. So I think those skills, if you foster them, if you value them, probably that's what could preserve, Bhutan's tradition. Because if you want to go that, I remember a person called Maurice Strong. He one of the one who helped somehow Bhutan to integrate the United Nations. And I met him and he said, you know, many countries around Bhutan, none of them can, Bhutan could become like any of those, spoiling the whole environment, cutting all the forest and making a lot of money out of it. So Bhutan could become like that, but none of those countries can become like Bhutan. So this is a treasure that we still have, still can be preserved. The fact that in the constitution there's a provision that 60% of the country should be in natural coverage is very precious, is unique in the world. I think Bhutan is only one of the 2 countries who has negative carbon emission. But at the same time, Bhutan suffers from the craziness of the rest of the world. You know, the glaciers are melting, there are many more lakes that didn't exist before, the more rains might break and flood all the valleys. You didn't do it, but you suffer from the general, Anthropocene and overconsumption and the great acceleration of the 1950s that created the Anthropocene. So it's a big challenge. But I would think that, cultivating the skills and preserving, agriculture and so forth, rather than going, to build big factories and all that, that would be maybe, I don't know, I have no idea, but otherwise it can become like any other country, yes.
Indeed. Yes, we have run over time, but I think there are a few people who wants to really take the opportunity to ask you questions. Is it okay if we extend for another 10 minutes?
The what?
Is it okay if we go on for another 5-10 minutes?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so that's...
Thank you, Matthieu Ricard. My question relates to one of the main essence of Buddhism, that is, if you do something bad today, you will suffer in your next life, which brings us to this theory of reincarnation. And Lama, as a Lam and as a scientist, how would you tell us about this reincarnation?
So first of all, karma means action. So karma is nothing else but the law of cause and effect, the same one that makes a seed become a flower and a fruit, but is a subset of the law of cause and effect that has to do with basically happiness and suffering. A state of mind like hatred, is it going to produce happiness? So teaching on karma says no. And then altruism, compassion, is it going to bring something positive? Answer is yes. So it's law of cause and effect. Now, reincarnation is a big subject. Basically, there's huge cultural difference. Here in Buddhist countries, Hindu countries, it's part of the culture. So people take it for granted. In the West, they think you are completely cuckoo. So what does it boil down to? The nature of consciousness. So that's the great question of neuroscience for the 20th century and now for the 21st as well. So now, there are basically two broad categories of scientists. There are those who are reductionist or materialistic, that says, well, in 50 years or so, when we will be able to map all the 300 billion neurons in our brain, 300 billion, as much as stars in our galaxy, and we will know everything about the brain, and we can predict every human behavior, so that consciousness issue will be solved. So now, philosophers, both Western philosophers and Buddhist philosophers, said that's the soft problem. It's not so soft, because to map all the neurons of the brain is not an easy task. There are a few projects, like the Blue Brain Project. But basically, more or less, many of the neuroscientists say this leads nowhere. Why? Even you say, okay, when someone sees red, or when someone feels love, or when someone feels anger, you can describe to the last neuron everything that happens in the brain without having any idea of what that person is experiencing. Zero. So the hard problem put by philosopher is that no matter what you talk about, even talking about the brain, talking about consciousness, Consciousness is already there. You cannot step out of consciousness for talking about consciousness, like you study a watch. You can study it from the outside. So the hard problem is that you can never dispense yourself from already being conscious to study consciousness. So they say that consciousness is a primary fact. You know, when you go to matter, down to quarks or quantums or whatever, the question of the philosopher Leibniz, why is there something rather than nothing? So the answer was, well, the world is. Unless you bring God and say God created all that, okay, that's the answer. Otherwise, you just have to acknowledge that the phenomenal world is there. So that's called matter is a primary fact. It is there. Now, if you look at consciousness, no, it's called the third person or the first person perspective. Third person perspective is you go in fMRI. I've been 100 hours in fMRI, and when I try to generate compassion, oh, they say, oh, that happens this and this and that in your brain. But if I don't say I was meditating on compassion, they would not know. I have to tell them, oh, I was meditating on compassion. So that's third person. They look at the brain from outside. First person perspective is I look at my consciousness by myself. Mind looking at the mind. Now, if I look at the mind more and more in depth, I don't come to neurons. I don't know I have a brain because the brain doesn't feel anything. They told me I have a brain, I'm okay, I'm glad. But I don't know. I don't know I have neurons unless I open my brain or someone else's brain. But I know that if I go deeper and deeper in consciousness, I come to this primary fact, which is the pure primordial consciousness. And that's a fact, and I stop there. So the idea of Buddhist philosopher and also the school of phenomenology in Western philosophy said that's the primary fact. You cannot say it's the result of the brain activity, it's just there. And it may be correlate. You know, when I feel anger, there is some particular areas of the brain that activates. When I feel love and compassion, there's different networks. But this seems to, according to Buddhists, it's a correlation. According to reductionist neuroscientists, it's a cause and effect. So that's the debate is. And frankly speaking, it's not a question that is being solved from the scientific perspective. We just have to keep the question open for some time.
So when people ask me if I believe in next life, I normally say, do I believe in this life?
Yes. So to finish the point, so if consciousness is a continuum and a primary fact, then it doesn't come from nothing. You know, in the Shantideva's Bodhisattva says a million causes cannot make to come to exist something that doesn't exist at all. So there's a continuity instant after instant of moment of consciousness. A moment of consciousness gives birth to the next one, not from a grain of rice, from a previous conscious moment. So the Buddhist idea, because of that, there's a continuum. It didn't start from nothing, it cannot go into pure nothingness, because nothing disappears into nothingness. So there's a continuum. In that sense, from the Buddhist perspective, we can envisage different state of existence. So that's the way, I think, the most sensible way of approaching that. It's not quite open to scientific inquiry, except looking at testimony of past life and so forth, or mind reading, or all kinds of things. There are a number of things that, if they are proven, could disprove the reductionist approach. So anyway, we are not yet there, but it's a discussion that is very alive between Buddhist scholars and practitioners and scientists, and it's one of the most interesting, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Let's come back to your person from this very big metaphysical discussion of reincarnation. My last question would be, now you once planned to make a harpsichord, but that dream never came about. Do you have anything that you wish you did and you didn't do? And what would be your advice to the young people here who may have such dreams?
What, buying a harpsichord?
Making a harpsichord or anything else?
Well, you know. Anyway, yes, I wanted a lot of things when I was young, but at some point you have to make choice. But even recently, I saw an advertisement for an harpsichord. I said, should I start? I'm not too old. And then I will be distracted from my practice and my meditation and translation. So there's a time for everything. I played a lot of music when I was young. And so it was, there's many steps in life. And it's good I didn't buy my harpsichord, because I would have used all my the money I set aside while working Pasteur Institute, and I could live for 7 years in Darjeeling on that, and I would have been totally penniless if I had bought that harpsichord and left. So,
Okay.
but it's one of the reasons why I was taken in Pasteur Institute, because François Jacob, he met a friend of mine, a professor of medicine, who told him I was building a harpsichord, which was not true. So François Jacob thought, wow, this guy he's 20 and he wants to come in my lab and he's building a harpsichord, he must be really good, so he took me. So I was not building a harpsichord at all. So
Yes.
I was lucky.
Yes. So thank you very, very much, Lama, for coming to Bhutan Dialogues and sharing your wisdom. We hope you will come to Bhutan again soon.
Yes.
And thank you everyone who have come to attend this session, and also all the online viewers. So have a good evening.
I would also to thank you and everyone and the director, because Bhutan is very, very dear to my heart. And now I'm doing, my mother is entered in 100 years, so I'm doing not babysitting but mammy sitting. But if I survive her, not sure at all, because she's quite strong, then certainly we'll find a small hermitage somewhere here or in Nepal. And then whatever years or months left in my life, to live them peacefully, practice and translate some text. So this is one of the places where I would be happy to spend the last part of my life, whatever is given for that. So thank you so much for welcoming here.
And may you live long.